Hey everyone, so in this video I just wanted to cover how to go about setting up your node-based textures to make it easier for you to scale them up or down depending on the size of the model that you're applying them to. So just to go over quickly the scene setup that we have, we're in Lightwave, we happen to be in version 10 and I have Viper running. And this is just a really basic, simple scene. I have two objects. I have three different lights and just a camera placed in there. The objects themselves are about a meter in width. The sphere is a meter diameter and the cube is just a 1 meter cube with rounded edges. And that will come into play later as we kind of go through this tutorial, see why that's kind of important at this point. And you could see in the lower right hand viewport I have Viper running, and I just have a texture that I already built that's applied to it, and it uses one of the material shaders. It uses the flakes, or actually it uses the car paint shader on there. We were just going to use this. I'm not going to go into how I built necessarily this material with the nodes, but it's more important how we're going to modify this node setup to enable us to scale the entire node up or down. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to hit F5 to bring up the surface editor, and you can see we only have one surface applied to these objects. So I'm just going to click on the Edit Node button, and we're a little limited in screen real estate here. So I'm just going to, I'm going to have this window maximized for this part, and I'm just going to kind of quickly review what kind of node setup we have. I'm using the car paint surface, which is a material and goes into the material node on the main surface input. And then I have a gradient, which is has a few different colors set up, and the input of that is being driven by a flakes node. And then I also have a veins node, which is going to a few different inputs of the car paint. I have a couple other things going on to affect the different specular colors and the roughness. But that's not that critical at this point. And I also have a ripples node, which is going into the positioning of the veins and the flakes, and it kind of is distorting them. So if I take them out, you could see that the flake all of a sudden actually looks more like the flake that that you're used to seeing. But if I put that back into the position, the flakes is actually distorting the shape of those two other nodes. So as we go and look through these different nodes on this texture, the first thing we would kind of notice is that we have three main nodes that would have scaling applied to them. So the flakes, if we open up the flakes, you could see that right now this is set to in millimeters 500, 750, and 500 millimeters for that flakes node. For this veins node, we have it set up to 500, 750, and 500 as well, which is, so those two are the same. The veins and the flakes are the same as far as the scaling. And then on the ripples node, we have that set up, and it's a little bit smaller, 200, 150, and 200 millimeters. If you were to apply this to a different object, and all of a sudden it's, the texture is way too small, too big, you really need to go through and start adjusting the scaling of all three of these nodes, and that can kind of get to be kind of a pain as you're doing this, or if you have a lot of textures to do this on. So this is what we're going to do, and it'll be pretty simple. I'm going to slide this window back out so we can kind of see our Viper window going on, and as we make any changes, you'll be able to see it update in the VPR window. Not really Viper window, but the VPR window. So generally what I do is I will set it up so a vector constant. So if you go to the add node and go to the constant pull down, and you could insert a vector node right there. If you double click it, you'll see it gives you the option for a value for X, Y, and Z. Now you could also set this up for the main one as a scalar node, and you can see it just gives you one value. And we'll go through and we'll kind of show you how that would affect it differently and the different options you would get with each of them. But what I strive to do when I do this is, whether you use the scalar or the vector, is I strive to get it so the texture, the way it is right now, is good at a value of 1. And you can see the default for the vectors, it's set up as 1 right now. So that's what we're striving to do. So what we need to do at this point is, if we were just to connect, let me drag these a little bit closer. If you were to drag this vector into the scale right here, you could see that, well, we don't want the scale to be 1, which would be 1 meter, it would be 1,000 millimeters. That's more than what we had before. And you could see all of a sudden in the VPR window that the scale of this has changed as compared to when we had taken it out. So if we go back to this flakes node, we could see that it was set up to 500, 750, and 500. So you have to just do a little bit of math, but it's pretty simple. So what I usually do is I use a multiply node. So if you go to the add node menu, if you go down to the math, and under vector you could go down to multiply, and that will insert a multiply node. And we're just going to plug this result into the scale, and we're going to run the vector into just the A input. And if you double click the multiply, if you remember before, we had actually, we could just double check. Okay, we had 500, 750, and 500 for the scale that we're shooting for. So to get the 1,000 millimeters to be 500, you'd want to multiply that by 0.5. If you wanted to get the 1,000 millimeters to be 750, 0.75, and again the 1,000 into 500, 0.5. So if you think of these as meters, rather than just a value of 1, essentially we have a half a meter, 0.75 meter, and 0.5 meter, which would be the equivalent of 500 millimeters, 750 millimeters, and 500 millimeters. So now when we take this, if you look in the VPR window, you kind of remember about the size of the texture and how it's scaling now. If we run this result into the scale right here, it's looking the same. It's kind of refreshing a few times, but the scale is looking the same. And that's because when we have this vector set to all 1s, when you multiply it by those values, it gives you the scale amount that we were looking for before. So if we go back to the veins node, we could remember that we had the same values in the veins that we did in the flakes. It was 500 millimeters, 750, and 500. So because it's using the same exact values, we could just take the result right out of that same multiply and plug it into the scale. And let's keep an eye on the VPR window, and hopefully it will render the same thing. So it refreshes a few times, and then it's going to go ahead and continue to render that, and it looks the same as before when we plugged it in. So now essentially we have the scale set up for our flakes and our veins. We will need a different multiply to have that affect the ripples correctly. We can't run, if we run this right into the ripples, you could see how the texture has changed quite a bit. The scale of the ripples has changed. So that's not the same scale what we want. So we need another multiply. So if I'm duplicating a node lots of times, I'll just right click on that node that I want. I'll copy it and then just paste that node in there. So we're gonna run the vector into the A again, and then we're going to run the result into the scale. But let's just double check the scaling that we want to end up with in the ripples. So if we go back and double click on the ripples, we could see that we're at 200, 150, and 200. So let's run the result into the scale of ripples, and just like we did before, 200 would be 0.2, 150 would be 0.15, and the 200 would be 0.2. So if we close that out, and as it re-renders, it brings us back to our original scale value. So we could start seeing why it was important for us to start with, these are kind of like test objects that I have that I'll start up a texture on these test objects, because the good thing now is we know that these textures are set up and look nice on these objects that are 1 meter. So these are basically objects sized to 1 meter, but the thing that corresponds with now is this vector node is 1 also. So why does that make a difference? Well, if we were to apply these surfaces to an object that, let's say, was 15 meters large, but you wanted about the same scaling to be applied to it, well, you could just go in, and now that you know the size of the object, you could apply and set this to 15, 15, 15, and it would give you the similar result as what we're seeing here at 1, 1, 1. So that's essentially why I'll set up lots of times these textures on objects that are set up at 1 meter. Now, if you typically work in feet or in a different measurement, you could set it up however you want based on that original size. So if you wanted to work on a cube that was 1 foot square, you could do the same thing. Set up your scaling so it works well with an object that's a 1 foot square, and you get the same results. Now, the other thing which you could do is, rather than use the vector node over here, as we know, when you adjust that vector node, you have to adjust the 3 different values. If you're never going to change this texture to be distorted in one of the directions, instead of using the vector node, you could use a scalar node. So we'll take the scalar node, run it into the inputs of these. So now we have the scalar node controlling it rather than the vector node. And after it refreshes, we could see how it still gives us the exact same result. The nice thing is now we only have one value to change, but you do lose a little flexibility, and here's where the flexibility comes in. If we were to go back and put the vector node back in there, let's say this is scaled just the way you want it, but for some reason, this object, you wanted to kind of adjust the texture slightly. Let's say instead of have it be scaled like this, you want it to be scrunched vertically a little bit. Well, we could just put 0.5 in there, and it's going to take all the node values and scrunch them down 50%. And you can see right very quickly we've taken this node. The only way it's changed is it's been scrunched vertically. So you couldn't do that if you had the scalar node. If you're never going to do that and you're always going to keep your nodes completely proportional, then you could use the scalar node, and you only have one input to worry about. If you want the flexibility of being able to adjust the entire node in either of the X, Y, or Z axes, then you could leave it on the vector node, or you could use it. Use some nodes set up with the scalar and some set up with the vector. Again, that's quickly where you'd want to kind of throw that in there. And again, that's why you definitely want to start out with objects that are set up to a specific size, again, whether that's 1 meter or 1 foot, but that will definitely help the process along. So again, if we go back to the node, the editing of the node, we can see how in this one case we just had to worry about these 3 nodes, because those are the 3 nodes where we actually were putting in specific scale values. Some nodes you may have a lot more or you may have less. But as long as you're running the scale through a vector and you're controlling it with different multiply amounts, you should be set up. The other thing which I will say, if you're working with, let's maybe adjust this one. On this one we had it originally at 750. If for some reason, let's say that was instead of 750, if it was 1500. You would just continue, the math that way. So it would be 1.5, and that would bump up the value to 1500. So it could be greater than or less than, the standard 1 meter. It doesn't really matter. So the math is pretty simple. Again, just you want to have your vector or scalar run into the multiplies as needed and run into all of your scales, and then you could easily have a single or your triple values control your entire texture. So I hope that was useful, and hopefully it will make your scaling of your node textures a little bit easier as you build them and build different textures.